people who resist change, people who experience change as threatening to their interests will always characterize that source of change as being destabilizing, or being a problem, or being a threat. And it sort of goes with the territory. So then the question is, how can you prepare for that, rather than how can you avoid it? And to me, that comes back to asking yourself the question of, what is our source of power? How is it that we think what is our way of thinking about where we are going to get the capacity to create this change that we need or want? And that's a fundamental question that any social movement has to face. Are we going to get it by persuading the powers that be that, well, we're right after all and they'll just change? That usually doesn't happen. Usually, in one way or another, it has to become more costly for them to resist change than to accept it. Look at what they said about Jesus. I mean, anyone who's provocative of change, so just think of it as a term of honor, and think of it as a term of distinction and honor. Yes, we are making a difference, but then the challenge is to be smart about finding the strategic capacity to actually make the protest count. Well, in my experience with the farm workers, one time we had several thousand people arrested. Everybody demanded jury trials. The counties couldn't afford jury trials for everybody. It became too costly. In Ferguson recently, we've been reading about how the overtime pay for the sheriffs or for the police is bankrupting the county. Now, see, we usually don't think about it that way. We sort of think about, well, what is our capacity to create a circumstance in which resistance to change is more costly than accepting change? And so that's thinking about, well, you know, what's our capacity to influence that, either politically, morally, economically? Most successful social movements figure out a way to do that. Boycotts have been a very common method that social movements have used to create change, because they mobilize the nonviolent capacity of people to withdraw, to just say, no, I am not going to buy this, or I'm not going to patronize this place, or I'm not going to... It sort of turns the power to say no into a real source of power. Gandhi discovered the power if enough people say, no, I'm just not going to obey that law. They can fill the jails with people. But those kinds of tactics depend on building a broad base of support. Violence can be used by a few people. Nonviolence requires lots of people. There will never be majorities that are out there trying to make change. It always starts with a smaller group of people whose understanding, or whose they find their sense of justice perhaps in conflict with the way things are, or their sense of identity, or who they are, and there's a tension there, a dissonance there, and so they're motivated to want to create change. Now the question then is how to reach out and engage others, and there's no easy answer to that. It takes a whole lot of relational work. It's not like marketing an idea, it's building relationships. Social movements, just like people who do religious organizing, it's built person to person to person. Because what a social movement requires is not just that you make your idea marketable, but that you actually engage a person in a process of learning. And you sort of have to ask yourself, well, how come I see it differently? Why do I see it this way? If I see it this way, well then, not why should, but why? What is it in my experience that gives me this understanding that this is unjust? Now, how can I engage with other people in terms of their experience to bring about a similar kind of understanding. A lot of times that requires creating tension, because, you know, most of us would prefer just, you know, just leave things okay. So it takes some real sense of dissonance between how I want to think of myself or think of the world as it ought to be and how it is. And that's the work of engaging people, doing that kind of work with people, so as to broaden and deepen understanding. And it's not a quick thing. But it means thinking very seriously about who are the people who would have an interest in change. A rising generation often has an interest in change because it doesn't want to live in the world that it finds. It wants to create a better world. People who are on the margins of the system often want change. Gender is often a grounds on which people want change because they experience being made less of than they believe they are entitled to. It's trying to think about who all those people are and then how do you engage with them around it. That's not an easy question, and because fear is a powerful demobilizer. So then the question is, how, as you put it, how do you give courage? Well, solidarity is one of the most important. See, it's why I keep coming back to relational engagement. When people sense that they're not alone, that helps. But also people have to be challenged. I mean, it's like, well, you know, what are you really about? You know, who do you really want to be? Sometimes organizers are called agitators because you're creating a kind of tension to challenge a person to step up and honor what they say they believe, but turn it into action, turn it into doing. I think that courage is built through solidarity. Courage is built through reminding people of what their deepest values are. Courage is also built through example, and it's also built through success. But it has a lot to do with how to tap into sources of hope, actually. Well, I think hope and optimism are two different things, and I think that only a fool is optimistic about everything, because the world is a challenging place. So the philosopher from Córdoba, Maimonides, said that hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. What he's saying is, I want to be a realist, and I recognize that in the world, it is always more likely that Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. That in the United States, that we would elect a black man president in 2007 was completely improbable. If you looked at all the studies, all the probability, but we did. And if you think in your own life experience, how many times has that happened, which you didn't expect, but it did? It's that sense of possibility, for me, is where hope lives. And you also have to ask yourself, what's the alternative? You want to live a life without hope? What kind of life is that? It's not any life at all. Movements aren't just about mobilizing, they're about organizing. And organizing means creating structures of leadership and decision-making and accountability. Now, you know, the American Civil Rights Movement, it wasn't one organization. There were maybe 5 major organizations. They operated differently. Sometimes they fought with each other and sometimes they agreed with each other, but they were all organizations. In other words, they had ways in which they could make decisions, ways in which they could act together, and ways in which they could think proactively. And I think that comes back to this question of strategy. Now, if our experience of structure is that structure is oppressive and structure keeps us from doing what we're trying to do, we're missing the point that we need structure to create space within which to do planning, within which to strategize, within which to figure out answers to these questions. And so I think it's closely related. Most of the movements that I've been involved in, the different organizations, they would have a focus for what they were trying to, say, desegregate buses, or trying to get restaurants to change their policy on seating. Or in my case, working with the farm workers in California, we were trying to get this supermarket chain to stop selling California grapes, as long as they failed to recognize the rights of the workers. So the responsibility to come up with a focused strategy is a movement responsibility. There may be different strategies, and there may be times that everybody converges and sometimes diverges, but you can't mobilize people around nothing. And that's where leadership comes in, and that's where the responsibility to focus. It's a critical piece. This whole system may be a mess, but where are the points that we can influence? Where are the decision-making points? Is it at a state level, at a municipal level? Is it at the national level? Is it in the private sector? Is it in the public sector? Where can we locate points of responsibility that we can begin influencing to change, to shift? And there's no one answer to that, but it means doing a very thoughtful analysis of power. But it's power understood as located institutionally in organizations and institutions. And then you figure out who to target, frankly. First of all, violence and conflict are two different things. And no social movement has ever succeeded at anything without conflict. But there have been more successful movements that have engaged in nonviolent conflict than in violent conflict. Violence is very easy to marginalize, it's very easy to separate out, and it's very easy to crush, frankly, because it's usually a fewer number of people who are using means that most people would not use, whereas nonviolence requires that you actually get a lot of people involved. And so it's, but nonviolence is not, it's a bad word, because Gandhi, who coined it, never called it nonviolence. He called it satyagraha, which meant truth force. It was a form of power, not a form of not doing something. And what we learned in the civil rights movement, the farm worker movement, was that nonviolence imposed a responsibility on you to be constantly proactive. In other words, you're constantly moving forward. You have your goals, you're working toward your goals. You're not sort of saying, oh, well, just don't be violent. We're saying, no, be active, be courageous, be forceful, be powerful in this way. And maybe in our case, it was going on strike, or it was organizing a boycott, or we had a problem where people were wanting to turn to violence. Cesar Chavez went on a fast for 28 days to remind people that sacrifice is involved in building any movement, and that unless we're prepared for the discipline and the sacrifice, then we're going to lose the movement. The opposition will always try to provoke violence because it's a way to discredit the movement. And the movement then has to be responsible for policing its own people. Whenever we had demonstrations, we didn't want our people to be policed by the police. That was our responsibility. And we had to step up to it, because then that demonstrated the fact that we really could be powerful. Another of the strategies that Gandhi talked about has been called the boomerang strategy, where people organize in a place where they may not have enough power to overcome the opposition, but they organize in such a way that they're able to mobilize the power of others whom the opposition doesn't control. So Gandhi was organizing a British public opinion on British politicians, not just in India. The American Civil Rights Movement organized in the South, but in such a way as to organize the North to put pressure on southern states. In our case, we organized farm workers in California to mobilize supporters in cities across North America to stop buying grapes from California. South Africa, Mandela organized in South Africa in such a way as to support sanctions on South Africa internationally that produced it. So it's a common strategy in social change to organize in such a way that you mobilize your supporters that are outside the reach of the opposition. Now, Mexican students in the United States are in a great place to have a huge and really important influence, not just in terms of moral support for people struggling in Mexico, but what are Mexico's interests in the United States? Does it have economic interests here? Does it have political interests here? Does it have a reputation it wants to defend here? You bet. And that makes it vulnerable. That makes the powers that be vulnerable. Are there particular Mexican companies, for example, that do business here, that have a lot of influence there? So I think it's important to think about the position of power that students in this country are with respect to the government of Mexico, so as to be able to open space for students in Mexico to proceed with their protest. Does that make sense?
Perfect.
It's a critical piece to the whole picture.